Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for inviting me. Sounds like I did tons and tons there. That's taken me about 20 years to get that far. Okay. I've got this slightly weird computer set up here because I haven't actually got much in the way of batteries on this laptop, so I'm sort of hoping that I'll be able to get through my presentation before it collapses. And it means I can just show you the slides and read my lecture notes at the same time. Okay. So when Matthew invited me to do a talk, it was because he'd seen that I'd been doing stuff on Refusal. I was running a reading group at a gallery in Nottingham, looking at ideas around the refusal of work. So I think he was expecting me to talk about that. I'm sort of going to talk about that a little bit, but really what I want to do is try to address a problem which I'm working on at the moment, which is questions about ethics and non-communication. Is it possible to have something like an ethics of non-communication? If so, what would that look like? So if this is kind of work in progress. So if I occasionally sound a bit incoherent, it's because I'm still kind of feeling out where I'm going. What I'm actually going to talk about primarily is an essay by Gilles Deleuze on Samuel Beckett called The Exhausted, which is in a little book here, was published with some of Beckett's final pieces of work for television. I'll be showing you one of his pieces for television a little bit later on. And I wanted to talk about this essay on exhaustion because I think it provides an interesting contrast or complement to ideas about refusal of work, refusal of communication. So I'm going to try and talk through some of those ideas a bit. I seem to have written quite a lot, so I don't know if I've got about an hour. If you all look like you're falling asleep, I'll just show the video and then maybe we can have a discussion on the basis of how far I've got. Okay, so the context in which I've been starting to think about this issue about the ethics of non-communication really has to do with the idea of control societies, which is a notion that Gilles Deleuze uses to characterise what he thinks our current situation with regard to power is. He's kind of in a dialogue with Michel Foucault, and he's trying to suggest that we've historically moved beyond Foucault's disciplinary society characterised by enclosure, surveillance, and so on and so forth. So he has this idea of controlled societies, and he writes a very short essay. It's only 6 pages long. Very short essay on controlled societies, which is published in a collection of interviews that he gave over a period of sort of 18 years. And I think it's the most commented on piece of work by Deleuze, which is very strange because it's kind of one of the shortest and it's probably one of the vaguest in all sorts of ways. So lots of people have claimed to find the second coming in Deleuze's idea of controlled societies. So, but I think he's touching on something which I think is quite important in relationship to kind of what's going on now with the kind of situation that we're in at the moment. So, at the risk of making it seem like I'm offering some sort of technologically determinist claim, I'd argue that information technologies and the complex apparatuses of knowledge, technical practices and material infrastructures that cohere around information technologies, to say nothing, of course, of the large tech corporations themselves, exemplify something of this shift towards control that Deleuze is talking about. I mean, very, very crudely, you might think about the decline of the welfare state and whatever form of bizarre international form of governmental regulation that comes after it, that is conducted through technological kind of digital infrastructures, as having relation to this idea of control. So in fact, as numerous commentators have suggested, often from very different points of view, the central role of digital technologies in the contemporary economy, it's difficult to imagine the intensified globalisation under which we live in at the moment without them. The central role of these digital technologies places an epistemological and, in fact, a material premium on language, and more precisely on the kind of formal language that shapes the configuration of digital technology, both as hardware and software. So there are a number of people from various different points of view who kind of talk about computation and talk about the kind of the central role of computation in contemporary society. You have people like George Kafentzis arguing that Alan Turing's the Turing machine that Turing invented in his paper on computable numbers in the 1930s is in fact the kind of abstract incarnation of the latest stage in capitalist exploitation, since it represents the kind of the logic of the commodification of work in its purest form. Other people, Christian Marazzi, argue that language under contemporary capitalism is a factor, if not the prime factor of production nowadays, because the economy is organised around just-in-time delivery, around the kind of coordination of supply, the rapid coordination of supply and demand, and that means constant processes of communication to try to kind of synchronise different aspects of production. So, I mean, there are other people that argue about the kind of the centrality of kind of computation and kind of formal logic in a very different vein. Someone like Lawrence Lessig, he's got this idea that code is law. So he talks about kind of computer code replacing law as a kind of form of regulatory device. We could sort of generalise a lot of what he says to think about the way in which the infrastructures work and the way in which we're sort of subjected through infrastructures. So I'm not going to talk about digital technology. You might be pleased to know, but I just kind of flag it up as the background to this problem of control that Deleuze is talking about. Because Deleuze, when he talks about control, he actually sometimes talks about communication societies. And he doesn't think communication is a good thing. And he says somewhere like the problem about communication is not that there isn't enough of it, it's that there's too much. We communicate too much. What we actually need is a break from communication. We need to find ways of thinking outside of its logic. So in actual fact, he in an interview with Tony Negri, titled Control and Becoming, they're talking about Marx and about the fragment on machines in Marx's Grundrisse, which lots of post-autonomous theorists have sort of held up as this kind of signalling something like the possibility of a communism of capitalism. And Deleuze is kind of a little bit sceptical about this idea, and he says to Negri, he says, look, you ask me whether control or communication societies will lead to forms of resistance that might reopen the way for a communism understood as the transversal organisation of free individuals. And he says, maybe, I don't know, but it would be nothing to do with minorities speaking out. Maybe speech and communication have been corrupted. They're thoroughly permeated by money, not by accident, but by their very nature. And he goes on to say, we've got to hijack speech. Creating has always been something different from communicating. The key thing may be to create vacuoles of non-communication, circuit breakers, so we can elude control. Unfortunately, Deleuze doesn't really give Negri any examples of what he means by vacuoles of non-communication. So we're sort of left kind of trying to piece that together. Happily, for me at least, I'm a bit of a Deleuze nerd, so I like to spend time wondering about these things. And actually, I think if one looks at Deleuze's work from the sort of mid-1970s onwards, where he starts to think about the role of art and the differences between art and philosophy and so on and so forth, one starts to realise that when he's thinking about kind of these vacuoles of non-communication, he's thinking about artistic practice. He's thinking about what filmmakers do. He's thinking about someone like Francis Bacon. So he's written a book on Francis Bacon. He's thinking about what Kafka does to the German language, the book that he wrote with Guattari on Kafka. In fact, in a lecture that he gave at FEMIS, which is a film school in Paris in 1987, he actually draws a very close link between controlled societies, art, and the problem of resistance. It's an essay that's translated as "What is the Creative Act?" It's a book that's been a lecture that's been commented quite a lot recently by the film theorist Raymond Bellour. But I mention it here because it's actually helpful as a way of pointing to the fact that if Deleuze is often a bit sketchy about what he means by controlled societies, he's typically very precise in his work on art and literature. So I think we might be well advised to read his discussion of art and literature more generally in exactly the context that he signals in his discussion with Negri. So to think about art and literature in terms of this idea of non-communication. Actually, I've got a quote. He's got a nice quote. This is what I mean about Deleuze being a little bit kind of vague about what he means by control. So he's talking about the motorway as an example of a system of control. So he's trying to contrast it with discipline, with the idea of enclosure. So it's a little bit wishy-washy. However, I press on. Okay, so that's the context. So it took me a little while to get around, elaborate that. So the context in which I wanted to situate this talk then is really trying to think through some of these ideas about non-communication and think about what that might mean, using some of Deleuze's work to help me. The title of the paper that I gave, I often find myself doing this. The title of the paper, I actually end up finding myself actually trying to work out what it was I wanted to say when I came up with the title. I kind of come up with titles before I know what I want to say. You can see that I refer to Spinoza in that title. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Spinoza. I find it very difficult to talk about Spinoza without talking about Deleuze, but that's probably because I think Deleuze took to heart a comment made by Bergson in 1927. So Bergson says to somebody in 1927, every philosopher has two philosophies. They have their own philosophy and they have Spinoza. And I kind of think Deleuze has sort of taken that a little bit to heart. But if I mention Spinoza, and if I want to talk a little bit about Spinoza here, it's because Deleuze refers to Spinoza in the essay on Beckett, The Exhausted, that I mentioned a little while ago. So he describes Beckett's work as quotes, relentless Spinozism. And it's this idea of a relentless Spinozism that kind of A, gave me the title for my paper, and B, kind of set me thinking a bit more about these issues about the difference between refusal and exhaustion for addressing issues of non-communication. So I'll come back to Spinoza in a minute. I better say something about refusal. I don't know if people know there's quite a long history of refusal. This idea of the refusal of work as a economic and political strategy. It's related. One finds it in particular in relationship to the Italian autonomists. There's an interesting essay by Mario Tronti called "The Strategy of Refusal," which in some ways goes to the heart of the problem that Deleuze and Negri in their conversation are talking about. But Tronti and the autonomists were not the first to consider the political potential of the refusal of work, even if they did confer a theoretical sophistication and I guess there's an unusually powerful antagonistic value on it. Maurizio Lazzarato, who's another kind of post-autonomist, in fact, in some of his recent writing, goes back to Paul Lafargue, Marx's son-in-law, the author of The Right to Be Lazy, which was sort of one of the first essays to deal with the problematic situation of work in relationship to the workers' movement. Should one learn to see oneself as productive beings, or does one need to think beyond the optic of production? Lazzarato filters Lafargue through Marcel Duchamp as a way to conceptualise the refusal of work in a situation in which the artist has in some respects become emblematic of the kind of subjectivity required for work under conditions of cognitive capitalism. So a number of people kind of talk about the artist as the kind of the ideal, typical figure of a kind of form of neoliberalism where we're all supposed to be highly self-motivated and highly creative. There are problems. There are enormous problems with the idea of the artist as a kind of an emblematic figure of subjectivity. Not in the least. I'll come back to that. I think actually what I wanted to say is it's a little bit too easy to focus on when we think about refusal. It's a little bit too easy to think about resistance and the refusal of work. Sorry, I've got a little bit lost. It's a bit too easy to restrict the focus of the question of resistance, which I'm trying to address with this idea of the ethics of non-communication, to this idea of the refusal of work. So this focus tends to keep us orbiting around what is now, I think, probably a fairly contested issue in Marxist theory, the issue of the labour theory of value. So the extent to which, actually, if we want to think about politics, the prime focus of what we should be doing, the key agent in politics, are the people who produce value. It's a kind of way of thinking about resistance that tends to privilege what gets seen as a kind of transcendent law by which to evaluate all situations. So, if everything comes down to economic value and the extraction of economic value, then, in some senses, the theory of value becomes the norm by which all kinds of political struggles get measured. So, your privileged position in any kind of struggle is measured by just how much you belong to, just how much you're proletarianised, just how much you're exploited. I mean, it's a little bit of a simplification, but I think it's probably true to say that a lot of the debate around the refusal of work has got a little bit hamstrung by that idea that refusal somehow must always be refusal of work. Okay, and this is a kind of a very live question in sort of post-autonomist theory. People attempting to think about ideas of immaterial labour and so on and so forth. So, if you're familiar with the work of Hart and Negri, they are contesting the labour theory of value, but they are nevertheless still thinking very much in terms of a kind of economic productive thinking of value. For Lazzarato, though, I'll come back to Lazzarato, in his reprisal of Lafargue and Duchamp, the problematic of the refusal of work is one that has not, he thinks, been fully addressed in the workers' movement. So I've got a little quote here. So he argues, part of Lazzarato's argument is that the workers' movement, in not taking up Lafargue's idea of the refusal of work, in getting too caught up in this idea of production as a kind of subjective essence of the labour movement, he thinks that they kind of they missed serious aspects of what refusal might mean. So the kind of labour movement very much bound up in mobilising people, and mobilisation, of course, big master word in a lot of political organisations. Acknowledging that the strike is a refusal, but actually not really thinking about what that refusal might mean. You refuse work. The workers' movement refuses work in order partly to gain rights and to gain recognition, but history tends to suggest that recognition has been recognition as workers, recognition as mobilisable agents. And for Lazzarato, that's a little bit of a problem. So he says, the fact of only problematising one aspect of struggle, the dimension of movement, has turned out to be a great handicap, making the workers' movement an accelerator of productivism, an accelerator of industrialisation, the apologist for work. The other dimension of struggle, involving the refusal of work, non-movement or demobilisation, has been neglected or insufficiently problematised by the opponents of neoliberalism. I do wonder, though, if we would get as broad an understanding of this other side of the issue of refusal, the movement of demobilisation. I do wonder if we'll get as broad an understanding of this issue if we don't consider the full reach of mobilisation and its implication beyond work. So, as I said, reading mobilisation in terms of what I was saying, describing earlier as a sort of a priori horizon of exploitation and economic value, seems to me to risk being politically disabling because of the extremely general terms on which one is obliged to look at things. So if you're trying to do an analysis, a political analysis of any kind of contemporary situation, so people producing software, for example, which is something I'm quite interested in, you tend to evaluate and analyse what they're doing in terms of movements of capital and so on and so forth. And that means you're actually not very attendant to what it is these people are actually doing. It's very difficult to mobilise people who don't see themselves in this optic of productive units. People who actually are more passionately attached to producing software or to doing techie things. It's actually, that is something that needs to be taken seriously, and it's not something that it's easy to take seriously if you have this very, very general optic through which you're looking at things. So in actual fact, mobilisation or motivation, it seems to me, is something that goes well beyond a problematic of economic structures and employment relations. And there's a recent book actually has come out by a guy called Frederick Laudon, who's an economist, French economist, who oddly enough turned to Spinoza as a way to try to address problems in kind of the Marxist theory of value. And part of his argument says, well, look, identifying the structures of the capitalist mobilisation of employees doesn't tell us what these structures run on. That is to say, it does not tell us what concretely makes them effective, not the ghost, but the engine in the machine. So, whilst you can identify structures of exploitation, and you can use them in your analysis pretty much anywhere you like these days because money gets pretty much everywhere. That isn't going to. His argument is that isn't going to tell you very much about how and why people are motivated in those kinds of situations. So his argument is that to get out of this trap, where you've got these economic structures that allow you to explain all sorts of things other than the passions that really kind of mobilise people, his argument is that we need to turn to Spinoza and Spinoza's thinking in terms of affect as a way to address this problem. So his Spinozist answer then to the problems in kind of Marxist ideas around economic structures and issues around and political issues around mobilisation is to turn to a logic of desire or a logic of affect that he finds in Spinoza. So I've got a quote here. This is a quote from Laudon's book. And what he's trying to point to here is saying, well, look, if you want to have anything other than a question-begging response to the issue of the relationship between mobilisation and economic exploitation. So if you want to understand how mobilisation works without simply assuming in advance that it's all about economic exploitation, then actually you need to start to understand how the kind of logic of affect works in situations that we couldn't say a priori can be characterised as capitalist enterprises. And the examples are slightly ambiguous. I think, a charity, is a charity a capitalist enterprise? No, probably not. Not in any strict economic sense, but there are all sorts of features about it that might be. Is a university a capitalist enterprise? Again, yes and no. They don't. Some universities still don't have shareholders, for example. That may be a situation that changes. Are artists capitalist entrepreneurs? I expect some of you wouldn't be able to answer that question better than me. But Laudon's point here is not to say, well, oh yeah, okay, these things could be capitalist enterprises. He's saying, well, actually, there's something going on. There's something going on about the kind of motivational structure and about how people are bossed around, because what he's talking about here is a theory of bossing as a kind of very general logic that we can use to understand this kind of the effective relationships in and outside the workplace. If we want to understand that, we have to see that it extends beyond pure economic exploitation. So NGO directors appropriate the lion's share of the results of the activities of activists, university mandarins, their juniors, artists of their assistants. All of this outside the capitalist enterprise, strictly speaking, and in pursuit of things that have nothing to do with monetary gain. These people are no less bosses for that. So, they're bossing, and there is a structure of bossing which is his way of kind of recharacterising what Spinoza talks about as servitude. There is a structure of bossing that is more significant and more helpful for understanding processes of mobilisation than a strict focus on economic exploitation. So it's a kind of general. So Spinoza for Laudon gives him a kind of a general theory of bossing, which I think is quite a nice idea. And this is, people are bossed around, and the prime relationship of people to their bosses inside and outside of capitalist organisations is a relationship of enlistment. You are enlisted, and I think the military connotation there is absolutely deliberate, because the military is the kind of the organisation that mobilises par excellence. So mobilisation, there's a little bit of a play on words here, which is slightly difficult to render in English, but a mobile in French is something that is mobile, but it's also a motive, right? Avoir mobile. So mobilisation, when someone like Laudon is talking about mobilisation, he is also talking about motivation. And it's interesting that we can talk about mobilisation and motivation, because on the one hand, mobilisation is an objective. It's, we can understand that in a register of objectivity, whereas motivation is subjective. So it's something that takes place at a subjective level. So to mobilise or to motivate is the kind of prime problem that underlies economic exploitation. Okay, so that's a kind of a roundabout way of kind of talking about refusal and saying, well, actually, if we want to understand refusal, we have to understand that there is a kind of deeper problem at work. Refusal makes sense as a strategy in relationship to a situation of mobilisation. So we refuse to be mobilised. Demobilisation is the side of the strategy of refusal that hasn't really been thought through sufficiently well. So if we think of mobilisation or motivation, it has this subjective aspect. Demobilisation must also have its subjective aspect. How do we become demobilised? And this is where I want to now talk a little bit about Deleuze and Beckett. Before people get upset, I'm not suggesting that art has the solution to the general problem of economic exploitation, but I want to look a little bit at Deleuze's reading of Beckett and his understanding of exhaustion as a way of coming back to this question about kind of demobilisation in the context of control. Okay, so I mentioned Deleuze's essay. It's a short essay, and it's actually a very, very condensed reading of the entirety of Beckett's work. When I say the entirety of Beckett's work, one of the nice things about Samuel Beckett is that he wrote quite short books, and the books got shorter and shorter and shorter as he got older and older and older. And I think that's a real plus, because the last few books are 10 pages long, something like that.
Got exhausted.
I mean, you say that is part of what Deleuze is trying in the background to Deleuze's essay, because what he's doing is he's tracing out the development of Beckett's work as a whole, and part of what he's talking about is getting older, and because the characters in Beckett, Beckett is one of the quintessential modernist writers of old age. His characters are old, they're old and they're immobile. A lot of the time. So actually, Deleuze is actually trying to address that's in the background to what he's trying to talk about. So Deleuze reads Beckett's work and its development in terms of the idea of exhaustion. And you don't need to be a Beckett expert to appreciate the kind of marginal or limit states in which many of his characters find themselves. Mostly, they don't do very much, or if they do, it's often in a bizarrely repetitive fashion. They crawl around, they do a lot of sitting, they do a lot of waiting. Sometimes they have their heads in their hands, or they move gently back and forth in rocking chairs. Who are they? It's not always clear. Sometimes they don't know themselves. Sometimes they take one name after another. Sometimes any specific traits that would allow us to speak of identity are erased or simply aren't present in Beckett's writing. Where are they? Mostly that's not too clear either. Any referential qualities to the spaces that Beckett's characters inhabit is by and large suppressed. Spaces are reduced to a bare minimum, boxes that constrain to the minimum of movement, bodies buried in the ground up to their necks, strangely lit cylinders, and so on. What are these characters doing, who are sometimes tired to the point of collapse or on the point of breathing their last? They don't know. They don't know very much. The minimum, in fact, of mental activity necessary for there to be thinking. Beckett sometimes says, and they really don't say, Beckett sometimes says, so I'm getting caught up in my own Beckettian syntax here. Sometimes Beckett's characters don't really say much, and they seek to say less and less. Lessness is actually the title of one of Beckett's stories, and as has just been pointed out, the books get shorter as Beckett gets older, and as he starts to, and for Deleuze, Beckett is exhausting language. He's kind of tired of language. Deleuze doesn't read Beckett, and Beckett is one of these writers, modernist writer in some ways, who's scandalised kind of Marxist realist critics. Deleuze doesn't read Beckett's work in terms of a commentary on the human condition, and he eschews the vocabulary of alienation that's so quickly and carelessly associated with Beckett's writing. He doesn't really share the kind of Marxist realist critique that would see in the loss of any obviously referential qualities in Beckett's writing a kind of nihilistic hopelessness. There is a kind of link in Deleuze's reading between how he understands exhaustion in Beckett and nihilism, but if that link is there, and I'm not 100% persuaded, it's really with this idea of exhaustion. It's really it's a link that I think is far better understood in terms of what we might see as Beckett's constructive attempt to overcome the demented mobilisation of energy in the process of production for production's sake. So there are other readings of the kind of logic of mobilisation that go a little bit beyond the kind of the Marxist the kind of productivist model. So Peter Sloterdijk, who Matt actually mentioned earlier, has a book called I think in German it was called Eurotaoismus. I don't speak German, so my apologies to any Germans in the audience. And I've got a copy of it in French, and in French it was translated as infinite mobilisation. And actually Sloterdijk has this argument that kind of mobilisation is the kind of the unthought premise of modernity, and it's something that for him is a kind of problem, because it leads to mobilisation is what is at the root of fascism, the kind of mobilisation of the people, and so on and so forth. So there is kind of a link in Beckett's work with nihilism, but it's not the link that you might think. It's a more constructive link that is really responding to the kind of pointlessness of constant possibility. Um, that well, it's actually not clear to me. I mean, people say there's no history in Beckett's writing at all. That's not entirely clear to me. And in fact, I think there's one of the interesting things about Deleuze's reading, where he talks about Beckett in terms of exhaustion and tiredness, and I'll come on to tiredness in a moment, is actually that it offers an interesting commentary on a very important set of historical discourses around the science of work and the kind of Taylorist scientific management movement. I'll come back to that in a moment. If anyone's read a book, that's a very interesting book by Anson Rabinbach, which is I can't remember what it's called now, but he's partly looking at neurasthenia, the emergence of neurasthenia as a particular kind of medical condition, but he's discussing this in the context of the science of work, which emerged in the 19th century. But if I've got time, I'll come on to that later. So Beckett Deleuze doesn't read Beckett in terms of any commentary on the human condition. He doesn't think about Beckett in terms of a logic of alienation. There's a kind of relationship with nihilism, but exhaustion is tacitly counterposed to kind of frantic, relentless mobilization. But nor does Deleuze approach Beckett in terms of conventional issues of literary criticism. So the sometimes metafictional qualities of Beckett's writing, for example, are of no interest to him. And in fact, we can understand Beckett's playful engagement with literary convention, and there is quite a lot of kind of what then kind of feeds into kind of postmodern playing around with the conventions of literature. There's quite a lot of that in Beckett, but I don't think Deleuze reads it in those terms. So he just doesn't read Beckett as a figure of the canon in canonical terms, which is not to say that there aren't problems with Deleuze selecting Beckett, a very canonical writer. So his exploration of the space of literature or fiction actually as an exploration of the anonymous and impersonal conditions of the logic of discourse. In the background here, so Michel Foucault, Deleuze's friend, calls on Beckett in his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France to frame his account of the order of discourse. So he says, what matter who is speaking? So he talks about anonymity. He draws on Beckett to do that. So I think when Deleuze is talking about Beckett in terms of exhaustion, when he's addressing the way he uses language, there's something else going on. There's something that he's trying to tell us about the logic of discourse, the logic of language more generally. One of the really interesting things, then, I think, about Deleuze's reading of Beckett is that he links the logic of what he's doing with language actually very closely to the content of his fiction. So exhaustion, there is, in Deleuze's reading, exhaustion is something that Beckett does to language, but it's also something that happens with the characters. So the exhausted that gives Deleuze's essay its title is a kind of what Deleuze would call a conceptual character. It's a kind of ideal type drawn out of Beckett's work that allows him to look at a philosophical problem, a problem about language, if you like. So in Deleuze's reading, we can say that what Beckett is doing is working or experimenting with a specific affect. He's extracting through the staging of the fiction, through the slightly demented wandering or the catatonic immobility of its characters, through a progressive sorting of postures and positions. So there's a lot of people that sit, and there are people that lie down, and there are people that do kind of contort themselves into all sorts of strange geometric shapes in Beckett's writing. We can see through Deleuze's reading that what's going on here is that Beckett is trying to generate something that's of a qualitatively different order to the kind of sensory motor logic of action. Beckett, of course, in the first instance worked with language, and it's in following the logic of Beckett's treatment of language that we can perhaps trace this out. So actually Deleuze kind of follows the process through the novels, from the novels through the plays to the television work, and he finds what he calls a procedure that Beckett brings to bear on language. exhausting language's role in the construction of a logic of purpose or intention that Deleuze thinks about in terms of the idea of possibility. Picking up in particular on Beckett's fascination for the combinatorial, for permutations. So there's a scene where one of Beckett's characters has stones in his pockets and he's kind of going through the stones in his pockets, and there's another one where he's obsessively counting, working out how many farts he could do in a day if he did X number of farts in an hour, and so on. There's a kind of a real interest in the kind of a kind of arithmetic logic of kind of possibility there. Deleuze kind of follows that through. He says, well, that's something that Beckett does, and that happens a lot in his novels, but that seems to give way to something else in Beckett's work. So in the plays in particular, where Beckett seems obsessed with trying to shut up the myriad voices of others, their stories and memories. And Deleuze sees this as a way of kind of trying to exhaust the sources of language. So if the novels, if you like, exhaust the combinatorial possibilities that language offers us of naming things, the plays kind of exhaust the possibilities of voices, others kind of speaking to us. And then the work gives way to the interest, particularly in the last stuff on television, but also in the poetry. It's an interest in kind of extracting images from language, from something that Deleuze says is kind of behind language, at the limits, at the places where words disappear, or in kind of strangely formulaic movements of characters around a square. And I actually just, you're probably getting a little bit bored of looking at me at the moment, so I'll put no. So we're just thinking there. Okay, so what Deleuze seems to find in his reading of Beckett is a kind of procedure that Beckett brings to bear on language. So inevitably he works on language. He was a writer first and foremost. But this actually is the play, the television piece Quad that Deleuze's essay was published with. So I'll just leave this on in the background. Actually, I might turn that down a little bit. You don't really need the Actually, you can't see it very well. It's kind of actually quite appropriate. You can't see it very well because often Beckett things are very, 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 very dimly lit. But if there's a square. There are 4 characters that basically exhaust all of the possible movements around the square.
Isn't it?
No.
Oh, wait a minute.
Anyway, I mean, you can, I can turn that one around and afterwards, and we can maybe look at it in. So what Deleuze is interested in, what he finds in Beckett is, and the reason why he talks about Beckett in terms of exhaustion, is he finds a kind of operation on language, an operation on communication, on the way in which communication establishes possibilities, which possibilities, in Deleuze's view, which possibilities are part of this, if you like, a logic of mobilising people for action. So exhaustion, which refers to a kind of a physiological state of an insomniac character who can't move, also refers in Deleuze's reading to a situation in relationship to language. One's exhausted the possibilities of language, and in exhausting the possibilities of language, Deleuze says what Beckett is seeking to generate is an image, something that we can see. We need language to see it, but it's not of language, if you like. So this procedure or operation in and on language, in and on enunciation, in its endeavours to generate something new, or an image in the terms Deleuze uses, something not seen or said before, extracted from language, places this, in some respects, on classic modernist literary terrain. But the interest of Beckett's work, it seems to me, is expanded considerably if one takes the view that Beckett actually, and this is where I think Deleuze's reference to Spinoza becomes quite important, that he's not reading Beckett as simply as a canonical writer of the great modernist tradition. He's reading Beckett as somebody who is thinking with language, and he's thinking with language in its relationship to affect, in its relationship to this kind of Spinozist logic of affect. And one way in which Deleuze puts this is to say, well, actually, great writers, a writer like Beckett is a diagnostician. I mean, actually, what he's doing is actually really quite weird. This obsessive working on language and this obsessive kind of minimising of language to an extreme is kind of weird. But Deleuze's argument is that actually that produces a diagnostic. So this figure of the exhausted provides us with a kind of diagnostic tool for thinking in the same way that one might use philosophy as a way to think about some broader state of affairs. So in this respect, I think one of the most interesting ideas that Deleuze draws out of Beckett's work is a distinction that he makes between tiredness and exhaustion. Tiredness, he argues, comes from the realisation of possibilities. So we tire ourselves out realising the possibilities that language expresses. Exhaustion, on the other hand, that is something that is in some way precedes us. It is, to use the quasi-Deleuzian jargon, it's pre-individual. Now, this distinction between tiredness and exhaustion is a strange and somewhat perplexing one, and I think it's probably true to say that it's not found widespread acceptance. It's actually not an arbitrary distinction imposed by Deleuze on Beckett from the outside. It's there, he suggests, in Beckett's work itself, in, for example, the postures of characters. So lying down is a posture of tiredness, because in lying down I get refreshed, and in being refreshed I can always get up and start carrying out actions again. So it's about one can continue repeating the same. It's a logic of the same, a logic of action. Sitting down, like the dreaming character in the piece Anachron Traum, is the posture of the exhausted, Deleuze suggests, because one is neither up and about, nor is one resting. And in this respect, one is active at nothing. Now, if a distinction can be drawn between tiredness and exhaustion, I think this is because of the way in which there is an active working on affect in Beckett's work. So my feeling here is that really what Deleuze is trying to suggest is that Beckett, in situating his work and kind of having these characters that are exhausted, that are tired, that are getting old, and so on and so forth, there is some reference to kind of our common sense experience of extreme physiological states. But in distinguishing between tiredness and exhaustion, Deleuze is saying, well, actually, there's something else. If we think about it in Spinoza's terms, there's something else at work in these extreme physiological states that we need to try to understand. If we don't understand them, we will kind of end up with this kind of situation where we're constantly thinking in terms of a logic of possibility, and it's this logic of possibility that Deleuze finds problematic, because Spinoza is the philosopher of necessity. Spinoza is the philosopher who says that possibility is just imaginary. We imagine possibilities. The only thing that is real is the only thing that is true. Only things that are truly necessary are real. And this idea of necessity is, some people have kind of adduced from this that Spinoza is this kind of extreme fatalist. But actually, the situation is considerably more complicated than that, and this is why Deleuze calls on Spinoza in his construction of what he calls the philosophy of immanence. So I think that when Deleuze is talking about exhaustion in relationship to Beckett, what he's trying to get at is this idea that through exhausting the kind of imaginary possibilities that language presents to us in normal communicative situations, we find something else. We find this, what Deleuze would call a plane of immanence. Right. So being exhausted, actually, and this kind of, in a way, brings me back to the thing that Matthew had originally asked me to talk about. Being exhausted, then, is something like being actively capable of passivity. So there's there's been a big kind of theoretical debate in the wake of people like Emmanuel Levinas about this idea of radical passivity. A number of philosophers and critics have kind of drawn on, and I think Deleuze is kind of tapping in a little bit to that idea of radical passivity, although he's using Beckett, and he's using this idea of exhaustion and these characters who are active, but they're purposelessly active. They're active at nothing, as a way to try to tease out something a little bit more interesting about this idea of a kind of active passivity. So being active at nothing, and this actually, I'm going to sort of move into the kind of very speculative part of my talk now, which really is a signal for you to come up with questions and objections and stuff like that. I just really want to end with a number of sort of comments and questions. Really, these are questions to me more than anything else, perhaps. What do we do? What do we do with this idea of a logic of exhaustion? Well, I think the first thing to say is it is obviously not the same thing as refusal. However, I think what Deleuze's reading of Beckett enables us to think a little bit about is about demobilization, so exhaustion, and the way in which Beckett addresses exhaustion throughout his work is perhaps a way of thinking in terms of demobilization. Since Beckett is, as far as Deleuze is concerned, Beckett is trying to think beyond a logic of action. So, I mean, in his books on one of his books on cinema, he talks about the idea of the crisis of the action image, a situation in European cinema in the immediate post-war period, so Italian neo-realism, for example, where characters don't know how to react to the situations around them. So there's no immediate extending of their reactions into some sort of action. And I think that what Deleuze is trying to do with Beckett and exhaustion, in some respects, is trying to think through that kind of issue in relationship to language, as opposed to, say, the cinematic image. So that kind of leads me on to a little bit of speculation. What do we do with it? Well, I mean, there's the obvious risk here of kind of taking an avant-garde, relatively avant-garde modernist artist as the kind of the privileged kind of the privileged voice for thinking about politics. It is an objection that has some weight in some respects. But I think one of the things that I think is interesting about Deleuze's reading is that he's not giving us a kind of an answer with his reading of Beckett. So this idea of a logic of exhaustion is something that it becomes useful to think with, to try to apply and to use in other kinds of situations. So addressing the limits of language, understanding the way in which language actually generates all sorts of possibilities that are just tiring and pointless at the end of the day, I think is one of the things that Deleuze might enable us to do. So we could actually take this Deleuze's idea of the kind of diagnostic quality of Beckett's writing and actually think about it in sort of therapeutic terms. Beckett is trying to kind of carry out a process of desubjectivation, enabling us to think a little bit differently about our relationship to language and about what it is we might be trying to do, or what we might do to try to resist communication. So non-communication is not speaking. Non-communication is not refusing to talk, but non-communication, at least following through the logic of Deleuze's reading of Beckett, non-communication is trying to do something else with the language that we have. Actually, I think I'll probably stop there because it's 9:30. It's 25 to 9. My voice is getting a little bit hoarse. I've said quite a lot.
Awesome.
Sorry?
Awesome. So far.
Oh, thanks very much. I mean,
Yes, very good.
I suppose one thing that I mentioned that, and I didn't really talk about. I mentioned this idea that, Deleuze distinguishes between tiredness on the one hand and exhaustion on the other. And some people have argued, well, you can't do that. What's the difference? There's no difference. And then I also said at one point that people have said, well, Beckett, there's no history in Beckett's work. But actually, I think that the distinction between tiredness and exhaustion is actually in some ways, is quite interesting because there was in the 19th century, quite a series of, there was quite a kind of discursive mobilisation actually around issues around tiredness and exhaustion in the science of work. And this is what I mentioned, this guy Anton Rabinbach, and I wish I could remember the title of his book. But
It's the human motor.
That's it. It's the human motor. So, yeah, and he's got this really interesting analysis of how a science of work in general, understood in very, very broad terms, drawing on concepts from physics. So work becomes the science of energy. Gets generated, and it has quite close connections to the Taylorist movement, scientific management. So this idea that work and human movements in the workplace are perfectly rationalisable emerges in part out of this really complicated set of shifts in knowledge practices, as much as kind of what was going on in factories and so on and so forth. It also has a kind of scientific aspect to it, and that kind of science, we all know that science of workplace management continues to exist today. So tiredness or exhaustion, Rabinbach refers to it, he talks about it as, actually Marx talks about that idea of Arbeitskraft, labour power in the abstract, which is actually really, really crucial in Marx's thinking as a way of thinking about value in the broadest possible economic terms. Rabinbach kind of talks about it as a transcendental materialism of energy. So tiredness and exhaustion are considered to be the same thing in this transcendental materialism of energy. And it's a general objective problem. And so it's actually correlated to, the vast physical concept of entropy, and the slow decline of the universe into disorder. And Marx's understanding of labour as Arbeitskraft really comes out of, at least in part, out of this very, very general way of thinking about work. So I guess that I think one of the interesting things about Deleuze distinguishing between tiredness and exhaustion is we can correlate, or we can think about tiredness in relationship to that science of work. And it's as if Deleuze is saying, well, actually, But hold on, there's something else going on here that even your recourse to scientific concepts to understand work in general won't really allow you to get a handle on, because if you're thinking about work in general, you're thinking very broad in terms of very, very broad possibility, and that for Deleuze, channeling Spinoza is a real problem.
I have to.
So
The man pretends that he's not solving a problem, but he is. So as long as he pretends not to solve a problem while he's trying to solve a problem, he's never going to escape from the absinthe den that Beckett takes him to. I'm going to tell you what I think the back door is that leads to a way out, because this is all very recent. This is like the 30s, and this is Europe, and we have built craft, and we have built industry, and then reinvented craft, and then art, and then comes Duchamp, who does nothing the whole day. But I go back 400 BC, and I look at Lao Tse. And Lao Tse says, do nothing. That's the natural state of things. So as long as this aims at solving a problem, it's like in the beginning the word sports comes from Sparta, so all these guys and girls would go and train for war. And then later we do not train for war anymore, and then we train to have nice bodies, but this is also not nice. So in the end we do a lot of senseless weightlifting in order to be exhausted, in order to be able to sleep. So a lot of energy is here wasted in order to find this state of peace that is actually the natural state of the universe. So why do we have to go through all this exhaustive process to end up there? I mean,
It's
like,
anyway.
why is this so difficult?
Well,
is this a problem that needs to be solved?
Well, you don't. No, but I think this is my the point I was making about what do we do with this at the end of the day? Well, actually, look, you don't have to do anything with it at all. You can ignore Beckett. You can ignore. You don't have to bother with it at all. What I'm suggesting is that if one thinks about mobilisation as a problem, as a kind of political issue that needs to be tackled, then there are issues that we then need to start to think about.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but here again, I have the impression that we are getting lost. Mobilization is not a thing. Mobilization is a tool.
Mobilization is a process.
Tool.
Well, mobilization
it's a tool.
is a process.
It's a solution to a problem that is defined earlier. So if I go back a little bit, the beginning of your paper, I look at the case, so there is all this mobilization. So why do all these people need to be mobilized? So first they need to be mobilized in order to till the field so that we can eat. And then they need to be mobilized in order to claw it back from the king who does not work on the field. And so on and so on and so on, and then comes the point where it's obviously not necessarily necessary anymore to mobilize. So then we walk around on squares for Beckett, and in the end we do nothing. But if I look at it like this, I forget that all along the way I always mobilize out of necessity in here Beckett Spinoza.
Yeah, and there's also,
Right.
I mean, I
Is
think this whole thing that you're just walking in circles, it seems like profoundly disconnected to, first off, people who like their jobs, right? Like they're witches, right? And secondly, to all those people who are getting into boats in order to find a life where they can work in a safe way, right? And not just because they need the money, like they want, right?
Sure.
So I'm always I'm always struck by the fact that the people who always talk about the right to not work and how much the natural state is not working, it's always these very, very hardworking academics as well. So because academics sounds very hardcore, and yet people who I know quite a few people who refuse to work, and they get very disconnected from the world. First off, they do less and less, and there's always a little bit of weird shame as well. So I don't, and there's also it goes to nihilism as well towards everything. It's a little the practice of not working, and your response is probably, well, it's because the values of working are so intrinsic in our society that if you refuse it, you become marginalized and alienated. But I think it's more than that. I think there's something doing, which is also not connecting, right? And then if you don't do anything, or if you don't create anything, I don't think it's so great psychologically.
Okay. Right. I mean, I suppose, I mean, I'm
I say a lot of different things.
I mean, I'm actually far from accepting the, I'm far from accepting the very general terms on which, a lot of the kind of, say, the post-autonomist thinking about these problems is posed. That's not the approach that I personally would adopt. I'm trying to think through. I'm just trying to think through this idea of non-communication, starting from my kind of slightly nerdy puzzlement about some things that Deleuze says in relationship to control. I don't think there's any denying that some people enjoy their work. Actually, some of the time I enjoy mine. But I think it's also true to say that there are significant aspects of the work that I do that I just wouldn't do if I didn't have to. I really, really wouldn't. I would not be doing answering God knows how many emails a day and so on and so forth. So the problem, and this is the kind of where the kind of Spinozist reading of the problem of work comes from, is this question about, well, why is it that people do continue to do the things that they really don't like doing? And this is for Spinoza. Spinoza isn't talking about work, but he is talking about servitude. Why is it that people would do things that are that actually aren't really helpful to them in the long run? That mean that you kind of can't sleep at night or whatever. So that's So it's not about saying people shouldn't enjoy work. But it's about saying, well, is there a logic to the way in which people are enrolled in work, and if so, what is that logic? And that's the Laudon argument. It's a logic of affect that one needs to think through, and it's a logic that is about mobilising people subjectively as much as objectively. You've got to put your heart and soul into it.
I was just thinking about identities and how much that is to do with the gaze of the other. So that if you think of an individual being autonomous, how much is that a reality? Since so much of our identity is built on the gaze of the other. So maybe reaching a state of exhaustion, maybe an aim to step out of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting comment, actually, and there are several things that I would say to that in response. And again, sorry, I'll actually, I don't know what that is. Actually, we could leave that on. Actually, I might find the other really interesting. And I have got an answer to your question. This is my Deleuzean nerdiness. A lot of Deleuze's work is a kind of an engagement with and a distancing from psychoanalysis, from Lacanian psychoanalysis. He worked with Félix Guattari, who had been analysed by Lacan, who spent his life working with psychosis, people with issues of psychosis in a hospital, in an institution. And there's a strong sense in Deleuze's work that when he reads literature, he's reading it starting from an engagement with psychosis, because for him and for Guattari, Lacanian psychoanalysis hasn't got a very good way of dealing with psychosis. So there's an issue there about the kind of, for Lacan, it's, psychosis is the foreclosure of I forget the jargon, but the foreclosure of the name of the father and all the rest of it. So already there's an issue about the big other that they're kind of trying to sidestep by starting with psychosis. And I think that in Beckett, when Deleuze talks about the kind of, Beckett Beckett's writing progressively trying to exhaust the voices of others, there is an element of a kind of what starts to look a little bit like a psychotic process involved.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to talk about is the annunciation, so that as soon as you say I, then there is the other in front of you.
Yeah.
So language is totally tied up.
Yeah. Well, again, and actually, there is, Deleuze talks a lot about enunciation, and he's actually very critical of. He's not saying that when we use the word I, that doesn't imply that others, there isn't some other there, but he's very critical of some of the ways in which that kind of personological aspect of language, the use of shifters, I and you. He's very critical of the way in which that is used, in some respects, as a starting point for thinking about the unconscious. And it's...
Yeah, I wasn't so much talking about the unconscious.
Right.
I have done some really interesting work with memory and drawing. And every time I do this workshop, it always happens. The results are always the same. So I've got no idea how scientific that is. But the workshop is that you ask a group, and I have asked groups of over 70 people, to do a drawing of their earliest memory. And then I get them to think about something else over a period of time. And then I get them to not look at the drawing, but write a paragraph about the drawing. And I get them to forget what they've written, again over a period of 20 minutes. And I get them to just think of one word that encapsulates that paragraph. Then I get them to forget that word over another period of 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And I get them to do another drawing. And it's fascinating how the perspectives always change in space, and how they actually divide the space of the first drawing, where they didn't have language to translate that drawing. And afterwards, when they did have language, when they had the one word to illustrate. And that's what I'm trying to say. When we talk about exhaustion, it makes me think of creating a space, really. It may be nothingness, but it may be plenty. It may be another form of chaos, if you like. So it's maybe an energy may come out.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. I mean, actually, when Deleuze, in that discussion of exhaustion, says, well, actually, what Beckett's trying to do at the end, he's trying to extract an image, and he the image is something that just has a very fleeting, appearance. It has an energy, and then it dissipates, and that he says that's what the procedure in Beckett's work is about. It's about trying to extract that from a language that actually ties us too much to kind of abstract possibilities or whatever.
Yeah, to be somewhere else.
Yeah. It's kind of utopic, but in a really interesting way.
So are you basically saying you're supposed to only do what you like every single minute of the day?
No. I think it would be quite. What is it that you would want to do? I mean, ideas about the unconscious would suggest that it's very difficult for us to do what we want.
Oh.
To know what we want.
To know what
Please,
we want.
let me hear again, because you talked earlier about language computation and control. Yeah, a very interesting thing that here again got drawn, absent Beckett. But I think that this is a really interesting aspect if you take, let's say, motivation beyond material reward into consideration. So the solution, or let's say the problem being, obviously, as you put it, that there is control because the narrative engulfs everything, and the solution is not participating in the narrative, not even consuming it in order to escape this aspect of control. I think that this is like the lazy way out. There is only one way that you can do exactly what you want the whole day. You have to be in full control of all aspects of the narrative. There is no other way, because if not, you're gonna end up doing what somebody else that has more control about language will devise for you. So to answer the question, why are people willingly bossed around by people that do not have the material positive or negative enforcement instruments anymore? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Because they would be bored otherwise. So if they're not capable of filling their own skies with products of their own fantasy, they will be doing what others decide for them.
I think if you, if I think about trying to communicate, if I want to talk to, let's say I want to phone my mum, on my mobile phone after this talk. Actually, I'm not in the slightest bit in control. Can't be in control of that situation at all, because there's a whole infrastructure in the background that I'm absolutely reliant on. This the kind of Spinoza's logic is actually we're always in this situation.
No, but please,
we're always in this
more
situation.
you know about it.
Oh yeah.
The more
it's
access
helpful.
and control you will have.
I think it's
so it's not like, if I don't have a mobile phone, then I can't call my mother, and therefore the problem is solved fine. But you will not talk to your mother. if you're willing to accept this as the outcome, throw away mobile phone.
In many ways, like what you're saying, I think is quite interesting when you think about what is the relevance of higher education, right? Because so many people are getting into debt, they're suffering, and a lot of the education that they would receive, they could actually get it for free, coming to places like this, online. There's all these ways that you can get the same information, right? But there's this, for a lot of people, there's this idea of social mobility and becoming articulate, whether or not that actually happens, right? And this idea that, like, I don't know, about refusal of communication as resistance just feels really completely divorced from social relations in many ways, like, because the people who are most articulate are able to actually have the most power in society. So it's a bit.
Yeah, I think that there are other ways of thinking about refusal of communication. I think there's first of all, there's refusing to communicate the self in some way, which is something that neoliberalism kind of forces on us. So it's we are constantly telling people who we are and how we are.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the kind of Facebook's like, that's what that's about. It's basically, look, this is me, and I'm shouting it really, really, really loudly because I really need to convince myself. And the more loudly you shout it, the more it becomes a commodity, the more it's able to be monetized. So for me, that's what I picked up, was that there is that kind of refusal of communication, which is a resistant move, and it's, I'm not the first to say it. I mean, it's been, it's not a new idea, but that somehow, particularly when you began, you were talking about coding, you were talking about computation, and you were talking about Deleuze and societal control, where he talks about us as being individuals, and it seems to make more and more sense the more we move through the 21st century that this actually does describe us. And the anxieties that come with it, and I think there is a great deal of anxiety attached to that repetition of the self, that constant repetition of the self.
I would like to hook in there, because I think there's an interesting aspect.
There is a sorry, someone had their hand up at the back for a little while. So
well, I was going to ask a question which was maybe a little bit more on the nerdy Deleuzean side, but hopefully it'll be useful as well. I thought it was interesting that in the essay that you talked about, the one on exhaustion, it seems that Deleuze is trying to find a way past the discourse of possibility, logical possibility. He talked about possibility a lot. Which seems odd because, I mean, decades previously, I thought he found a way of not talking about possibility, which is talking about virtuality, the actual close to possible and real. So, and especially given the fact that in Difference and Repetition, he uses the concept of virtual to argue against the problem of entropy, and the problem of the exhaustion of all work. I was just wondering what you thought about why he kind of came back to that as a problematic possibility, rather, and kind of not drawing on his own previous philosophy, but kind of coming at it completely new.
I'm not sure he's coming at it completely new. I mean, the essay on Beckett really picks up a whole load of things that he'd already been talking about, and there are all sorts of interesting connections between that essay and other later pieces of Deleuze's work. I don't have a detailed answer, but my sense is that there's something very weird is happening with Deleuze. Actually, there's quite a big shift in Deleuze's work in those last few years. Last few years of his life.
It might be relevant that you talk about Spinoza's the way his work kind of gets exhausted as he gets older and moving towards death. And Deleuze at this point is, I think, very ill and very close to his own death. So the fact that he's talking about exhaustion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's always, Deleuze. One of the things Deleuze does quite well is he always talks about himself, but he manages to talk about himself, through using others. So there's a kind of practice of commentary or of kind of thinking with, if you like, in Deleuze. So you can read sort of biography into it, I think, in interesting ways. But yeah, I think actually the essay that you have to read, if the really interesting essay to read if you're going, if you're wondering about that, is the last essay that he wrote on Spinoza, called Spinoza and the Three Ethics, which is really him revisiting the entirety of his own work and condensing it into sort of, a 20-page, 10-page maybe commentary on Spinoza.
Have you got any final questions for Andrew? Okay, let's give Andrew a round of applause.